I want to tell you about my grandmother's cottage. Nestled in the Austrian countryside where the mountains meet gentle rolling hills. It's the kind of place where time moves slowly, where seasons change like pages, turning in a favorite book. My grandmother was a cartographer, you see. She spent her life drawing maps of beautiful places, documenting the quiet corners of the world where peace could be found. Her cottage sat surrounded by the most extraordinary garden I've ever seen. Plants that seemed to grow in patterns, pathways that curved like the contour lines on her maps. I inherited the cottage 3 months ago, along with her cartography tools and a lifetime of beautiful hand-drawn maps. But it was the garden that held the real mystery. A mystery that would teach me about the gentle persistence of love and how some boundaries exist not to separate, but to connect. Let me tell you about the maps that grew like flowers and the flowers that bloom like memories. The train journey from Vienna was one of those slow, winding routes through mountain valleys where every turn reveals another postcard view. I dozed against the window, watching terraced vineyards and alpine meadows drift past. Bergenhof station was little more than a platform beside a babbling stream. The station master, an elderly man with kind eyes, helped me with my luggage and pointed toward a path that wound up through pine trees. "Your grandmother's cottage," he said with a warm smile. "She drew the most beautiful maps of these hills. We'll miss seeing her walk these paths." The cottage appeared gradually through the trees, exactly as I'd imagined from her letters. Stone walls covered in climbing roses, windows that caught the afternoon light like gentle eyes, and a garden that seemed to flow seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. But it was only when I walked closer that I noticed something wonderful and strange about the garden beds. They weren't random plantings, but careful patterns that seemed familiar somehow. The flower beds curved and wound like the topographical lines on her maps. Roses planted in clusters that matched the way she marked villages. Herb gardens that spiraled like the contour lines around mountain peaks. She had turned her garden into a living map of the landscape she loved. Inside, the cottage was warm, with afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Her drawing table still held maps in progress, pencils arranged just as she'd left them, as if she'd simply stepped outside to tend the roses. I made myself tea and sat at her table, looking out at the garden as twilight began to paint the mountains purple. That's when I noticed something that made me smile with gentle surprise. The newest plantings in the garden seemed to be growing in patterns I didn't recognize. New pathways appearing among the established beds, leading to areas that hadn't been there in any of her photographs. It was as if the garden was still being mapped by invisible hands. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through curtains embroidered with tiny maps of imaginary islands. My grandmother had always loved to dream of places that might exist, just beyond the edge of known territory. With my coffee, I walked into the garden to explore the new pathways I'd glimpsed the night before. In daylight, they were even more beautiful. Someone had been planting night-blooming jasmine in perfect spirals, creating fragrant routes between the established flower beds. But here's the gentle mystery. According to the neighbors, no one had seen anyone tending the garden since my grandmother passed 3 months ago. She always said the garden would take care of itself, Mrs. Hoffman from the neighboring cottage told me over the garden fence. We thought she was just being poetic, but look how beautifully everything's growing. I spent that first week settling into the cottage's rhythms. Morning coffee at the drawing table, afternoons walking the mountain paths my grandmother had mapped, evenings reading in the garden as the stars emerged. Each day I noticed small changes in the plantings, a new cluster of forget-me-nots appearing near the herb spiral, wild strawberries spreading in patterns that looked like the way she marked water sources on her maps. It was during my evening walks that I began to understand what was happening. I would catch glimpses of movement among the roses, just at the edge of my vision. A figure in a familiar cardigan, tending to the plants with the same careful attention my grandmother had always shown. But when I turned to look directly, there would be only evening shadows and the soft movement of leaves in the breeze. I wasn't frightened. How could I be frightened by a presence that brought such careful beauty to the world? Instead, I felt a deep comfort, like being watched over by someone who loved this place as much as I was beginning to. My grandmother had always said that the places we love become part of us, and we become part of them. Perhaps this garden was simply her way of staying connected to the landscape she'd spent her life documenting. As the weeks passed, I began to learn the garden's language. Each new planting seemed to correspond to something in my grandmother's maps and journals. When I found her notes about a hidden waterfall in the eastern mountains, lavender appeared in a winding line leading toward that direction. When I discovered her sketches of an ancient stone circle, white roses bloomed in a perfect ring near the cottage wall. The garden was becoming a three-dimensional version of her maps, a living guide to the secret places she'd discovered in these mountains. I started bringing her maps outside each morning, spreading them on the old wooden table she'd placed beneath the apple tree. As I studied her careful notations and beautiful drawings, I would sense that gentle presence moving through the garden, adding touches here and there. "You're still mapping, aren't you, grandmother?" I whispered one morning, watching a butterfly land on a newly planted cluster of wild mint. "Still finding ways to show people the beauty hidden in familiar places?" That afternoon, I decided to follow one of the garden's newest pathways. It led me through the gate and onto a mountain trail I hadn't noticed before, marked by the same wildflowers that had appeared in the garden beds. The trail wound upward through pine groves and meadows, past streams that sparkled in the dappled sunlight. At each turn, I found flowers that matched my grandmother's botanical sketches, as if someone had been planting waymarks for me to follow. 2 hours of gentle climbing brought me to a clearing I'd never seen on any official map. A perfect circle of ancient stones, exactly as my grandmother had sketched them, surrounded by wildflowers in every color imaginable. In the center of the circle, someone had planted a single white rose, its petals catching the afternoon light like snow. I sat beside the rose and opened my grandmother's journal to the page about this place. She'd written, "Some boundaries mark endings, but others mark beginnings. The stone circle teaches us that every ending leads back to a new start." As I read those words, I understood that this garden, this trail, these gentle signs were her way of showing me that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, grows in new directions, continues to nurture and guide. I spent the rest of that afternoon in the stone circle, mapping the wildflower patterns and making notes about the trail markers, knowing that someday I might guide others to this peaceful place. When I returned to the cottage at sunset, new flowers had appeared along the garden pathways, as if thanking me for following where they led. That evening, I sat at my grandmother's drawing table with her maps spread around me and a cup of chamomile tea growing cool as I worked. For the first time since arriving, I took up her pencils and began to draw. I mapped the new trail to the stone circle, noting the wildflower waymarks and the gentle difficulty of the climb. I sketched the clearing with its ring of ancient stones and the perfect white rose at its heart. As I drew, I became aware of that familiar presence again, closer than before. A warmth beside my shoulder as if someone were looking over my work with approval. "Is this what you wanted?" I asked the evening air. "For me to continue mapping the hidden places?" The answer came not in words, but in a subtle shift in the garden outside. Through the window, I watched fireflies begin to dance among the roses, their lights tracing the same patterns as the pathways we'd created together. Over the following weeks, the garden revealed more trails. Each morning brought new flower arrangements pointing toward unexplored directions, a line of wild mint leading to a hidden grove where deer came to drink, bluebells marking the path to a viewpoint where eagles nested. I mapped them all, adding to my grandmother's collection of secret places. But more than that, I began to understand her true gift. She hadn't just been documenting geography, she'd been creating connections between people and the landscape they shared. Local hikers started stopping by the cottage, drawn by word of the beautiful garden and the maps of hidden trails. I would invite them for tea and share the routes my grandmother had discovered, watching their faces light up as they planned their own explorations. "Your grandmother opened our eyes to so many places we'd walked past for years," one elderly hiker told me. "She taught us to really see our own mountains." The garden continued to grow and change, always offering new guidance. When a young couple mentioned wanting to propose somewhere special, a path of white roses appeared leading to a secluded waterfall. When a family with children visited, bright orange marigolds marked a safe trail to a meadow perfect for picnicking. I realized that my grandmother's presence in the garden wasn't something separate from the natural world. It was part of the same loving attention she'd always given to this place. Her care for the landscape had become so deep that it continued even after her physical presence ended. I began to tend the garden with the same reverence, learning which plants thrived where, understanding how the pathways connected not just physical locations, but emotional experiences. The garden was teaching me to map with my heart as well as my mind. Each evening, I would update the trail maps and write notes about what travelers might find at each destination, not just geographical features, but the feelings these places could evoke: peace, wonder, connection to something larger than themselves. Autumn arrived with a spectacular display of color that transformed the garden into a living tapestry. The paths my grandmother had planted with spring flowers now glowed with golden leaves and burgundy branches, creating new patterns that led to different seasonal discoveries. I had been living in the cottage for 3 months when I understood the full scope of what she'd been creating. This wasn't just a garden with unusual plantings. It was a living map that changed with the seasons, revealing different aspects of the landscape throughout the year. Winter paths marked by evergreen branches and hollyberries. Spring routes highlighted by flowering trees and early bulbs. Summer trails defined by perennial blooms and shady rest spots. Autumn ways marked by trees chosen for their spectacular color displays. She mapped time as well as space, I whispered to the garden one crisp morning, watching my breath form clouds in the clear air. She showed how the same landscape can offer completely different gifts depending on when you visit. That's when I noticed them, the notebooks, small weather-resistant journals hidden in various spots throughout the garden, each containing observations from visitors who had followed the flower-marked trails. Found the most incredible sunrise viewpoint. Will bring my children here next week. The waterfall pool is perfect for summer swimming. Thank you for sharing this secret. Proposed at the stone circle today? She said yes. My grandmother had created more than a garden and more than maps. She'd established a network of connection between people and place, a way for the landscape to continue sharing its gifts long after any individual caretaker was gone. Word spread quietly through the valley about the cottage with the magical garden and the maps that led to hidden treasures. People began arriving not just for day hikes, but to learn about the connection between careful observation and deep appreciation of place. I started offering simple workshops on nature mapping, teaching visitors how to create their own records of special places. We would walk the garden pathways together, learning to notice the subtle signs that revealed the landscape's secrets. The key, I would tell them, sharing wisdom I was still learning myself, is to approach the landscape as a conversation partner, not a resource to be used. Ask what it wants to show you and be patient enough to listen for the answer. As winter approached, I wondered if the garden's guidance would continue through the dormant season. I needn't have worried. Even as the flowers faded, the bones of the paths remained visible, leading to winter treasures I was only beginning to discover. Cross-country ski routes marked by strategically placed evergreens. Paths to overlooks where winter sunsets painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Trails to sheltered spots where winter birds gathered, creating opportunities for quiet observation. The garden had taught me that every season, like every ending, was also a beginning. My grandmother's physical presence had ended, but her way of seeing and sharing the world's beauty continued to grow and adapt and invite others into deeper relationship with place. I spent my first Christmas Eve in the cottage writing thank you notes to my grandmother, knowing somehow that she could sense my gratitude. Gratitude for the gift of this place, for the wisdom embedded in its pathways, for the community of care that continued to grow around her vision. Outside, the winter garden sparkled under starlight, its paths leading to mysteries I had years to explore and decades to understand. Spring returned with an explosion of beauty that surpassed even my growing expectations. The garden had spent the winter preparing surprises, and as the snow melted, new patterns emerged that took my breath away. Crocuses bloomed in spirals that led to overlooks I'd never noticed. Daffodils created golden pathways to hidden groves, where early wildflowers carpeted the forest floor. Cherry trees blossomed along routes that connected to larger trail networks throughout the valley. But the most beautiful discovery was a new section of the garden that had somehow developed over the winter. A memorial grove where previous visitors had planted trees and flowers in honor of loved ones they'd lost, creating a space where grief and beauty intertwined. Each person who loved this place added something, I realized, reading the small plaques that mark various plantings. The garden keeps growing because love keeps growing. I began to see my role not as the inheritor of my grandmother's work, but as the current caretaker of something much larger, a living demonstration of how human attention and natural beauty could create something greater than either could achieve alone. Visitors continued to arrive throughout that second spring, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations and the growing collection of trail maps I'd been creating. But now they came not just to receive the garden's gifts, but to add their own contributions. A botanist planted native species that attracted rare butterflies. A family whose grandfather had hiked these mountains for decades shared his hand-drawn maps of winter routes. Local school children adopted sections of the garden, learning to tend plants while connecting with their own landscape. The cottage became a gathering place for people who understood that the most beautiful maps were created through collaboration between human wisdom and natural revelation. We were all learning to read the landscape's own cartography, the way water carved valleys, the patterns of animal trails, the succession of plant communities through the seasons. One evening in late spring, as I sat updating the trail maps by lamplight, I felt that familiar presence more clearly than ever before. Not just my grandmother, but all the love and attention that had been poured into this place over the years. "Thank you," I whispered to the gathering dusk. "Thank you for showing me that maps aren't just drawings of where we've been. They're invitations to where we might go." The garden rustled in response, and I knew that this work would continue long after I was gone. Other caretakers would come, adding their own understanding to the pathways, discovering new routes through both landscape and meaning. I looked out at the paths winding through moonlit flowers and realized I was witnessing something beautiful and eternal. The way love transforms into landscape, and landscape transforms into invitation, and invitation transforms into community, and community transforms back into love. The map my grandmother had started would never be finished, because the territory it documented was alive and growing, and constantly revealing new aspects of its beauty. These days, I wake each morning to the sound of birds in the memorial grove and the sight of paths leading in directions I'm still discovering. The cottage has become a center for what we now call heartful cartography, mapping that honors both geographical accuracy and emotional truth. Visitors arrive from around the world, drawn by stories of the garden that teaches people to read the landscape with love. They come as hikers and stay as students, learning that every place has hidden gifts for those patient enough to look with attention. We've started a small publishing project, creating beautiful maps that combine traditional cartographic accuracy with notes about the emotional and spiritual experiences different landscapes can offer. Each map includes not just elevation and distance, but suggestions for mindful observation and grateful engagement. "Your grandmother would be proud," Mrs. Hoffman told me last week, watching a group of children learn to map their favorite play spots in the village. She always said that understanding geography was really about understanding how to be fully present in the world. The garden continues to evolve, guided by some combination of natural growth patterns, careful human tending, and what I can only describe as loving intention from beyond the physical world. New pathways appear when they're needed, leading to exactly the right destinations for whoever is ready to discover them. I've learned to trust this guidance, following flower-marked routes to hidden waterfalls when stressed visitors need the sound of flowing water, or discovering sun-warmed meadows when someone arrives carrying grief that needs gentle warmth to heal. The cottage library has grown to include journals from hundreds of visitors, each documenting their own discoveries in these mountains. Reading their experiences has taught me that every person who approaches landscape with openness and respect becomes a cartographer of wonder. Children draw maps of fairy houses they've built in root hollows. Artists sketch the play of light through forest canopies. Scientists document the migration patterns of butterflies. Elders record the stories these mountains have whispered to them over decades of careful listening. Each contribution adds to our understanding that geography is ultimately about relationship, the connection between human consciousness and the living world that sustains us. As I prepare for sleep each night, I walk the garden pathways one more time, checking on new plantings and noticing any changes that suggest tomorrow's explorations. The paths wind through moonlight and shadow, leading to dreams of all the places still waiting to be discovered. Before going inside, I always pause at the apple tree where my grandmother's drawing table still sits, now weathered to silver gray and hosting a small community of plants that volunteer in its crevices. The work continues, I tell her memory, touching the table's smooth surface. The maps keep growing, and the pathways keep leading people toward beauty. And in the gentle rustling of leaves, in the movement of night-blooming flowers opening to starlight, in the contentment of a place well-loved and carefully tended, I hear her answer, "Yes, dear one, the work continues." Tonight, as every night, I'll fall asleep to the sound of the garden breathing around the cottage, leaves rustling with each gentle breeze, nocturnal flowers releasing their fragrance into the darkness, the distant murmur of the stream that has been mapping this valley for centuries. The maps spread across my grandmother's table show routes through landscapes both geographical and emotional. Pathways that lead to viewpoints where sunrise teaches patience, to groves where ancient trees offer perspective on the length of time, to clearings where silence creates space for whatever wisdom wants to emerge. I've learned that the most important maps are drawn not with pencils on paper, but with attention and gratitude in the living world. Every careful step through landscape, every moment of wonder at natural beauty, every act of stewardship and protection adds lines to the map of right relationship with place. The garden has taught me that love doesn't end with individual lifetimes. It transforms into ongoing care, continuing guidance, persistent invitation for others to discover the beauty that love has learned to see. Somewhere in the memorial grove, night-blooming jasmine releases its sweetness to stars. Somewhere along the mountain trails, wild strawberries ripen for tomorrow's hikers to discover. Somewhere in the stone circle, the white rose holds moonlight in its petals like a cup of luminous water. And somewhere between sleeping and waking, in that gentle space where consciousness meets dreams, new pathways are always appearing, leading toward territories of beauty we haven't yet learned to map. The work continues in the hands of everyone who approaches the world with curiosity and care. The garden grows in every place where human attention meets natural beauty with gratitude. The maps keep drawing themselves, one careful step at a time, one loving glance at a time, one moment of presence at a time, leading always toward home. Sleep well, fellow cartographers. Dream of the beautiful territories that are waiting for you to discover them.